Fade to Black is a 1980s tongue-in-cheek horror thriller that was both written and directed by Vernon Zimmerman. Zimmerman himself only has a few credits to his name, though arguably his most notable are The Unholy Rollers and Teen Witch. In many ways, it's a shame that his filmography is as small and as diverse as it is, as I think it would have been really interesting to get a more firmer grip on his writing and directional style. As it stands, it's arguable that Fade to Black is probably his best known film, and that's not saying much considering this lingers in relative obscurity. In fact, had I not got a passion for watching old TV commercial breaks, I probably would have never found this film in the first place at all. I first saw this movie as a trailer over on the 80s Commercial Vault's YouTube channel, a great little place if you like to check out old adverts. And I was absolutely smitten with the trailer's setup and premise. It's nothing particularly groundbreaking, but the way it handles putting across the movie's content I thought was really neat. So I put it to the back of my mind for a while, and one day I just felt compelled to finally give it a go. The film follows Eric, a somewhat nerdy 20-something who's absolutely obsessed with old movies, particularly gangster, horror and western pictures. He's a total know-it-all, but he's slowly being driven quite insane through a mixture of self-destructive physical behaviour and psychological torment at the hands of his employers and his aunt who he lives with. One day while working, Eric meets a girl who bears a striking resemblance to Marilyn Monroe, and after talking to her for a short time, he falls head over heels for her. The pair agree to meet on a date, but a timing accident means that Eric is led to believe that he's been stood up. He returns home that night to find his aunt verbally abusing him, and when she takes things too far by attempting to destroy Eric's film collection, he snaps, thus beginning a long trail of attempted murder and vengeance against those he believes have wronged him. One of the easiest and quickest ways to describe this film is basically imagine a prototype version of Scream, with maybe just a hint of the mentally unhinged elements of Christmas Evil. Except instead of following the victims, we instead follow the killer. The only significant difference between this and Scream is that Eric is implied to be mentally unwell after years of psychological neglect, and that most of the on-screen deaths are accidental. This film is absolutely chocked with references, with straight homages to Psycho and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, right the way through to more literally spoken references to films like White Heat and Dracula, through to more subtle Easter eggs, like the boss of the film distribution company Eric works for having posters of Halloween and Tourist Trap on his walls, two of the then most recent horror slashers to have come out. In many ways, this film is just enjoyable from a spot the references perspective. It's very clear that Zimmerman had a real love for film and cinema, but beyond the references is a film that's easily 15 years ahead of its time. Which is probably why it was critically successful, but commercially tanked. It was dealing with meta ideas that were just a bit too out there for audiences of the late 70s and early 80s. Not to be a snob about it, mind. This film knows it's trying to be cerebral, and if anything, it embraces that quality. It's not trying to draw the jock taking his girlfriend out to the movies on a Saturday night. It's trying to get the Jay Shermans and the comic book guys of the world on those seats. Which for a time when film as an art was only just beginning to really become a thing, mainly due to the slow rise of domestic home video, was really a massive gamble. I think arguably the two biggest elements that work in this film's favour are the actual performances themselves and the cinematography and lighting. From a performance perspective, this film has a really decent stable of actors, with Dennis Christopher playing an absolute blinder as Eric, taking on multiple characters and roles with an almost effortless charm. He may well look here like the love child of Tom Holland and Michael Cera, but he's arguably one of the best elements of this production, especially when he's playing alongside Eve Brent Ash as his wheelchair-bound Aunt Stella. The two have an on-screen chemistry that's both volatile and edge-of-your-seat enjoyable. I also have to mention Linda Kerridge, who plays Eric's love interest Marilyn throughout the movie. She's really good in this, and has a lively personality that comes across as a believable girl-next-door type. I mean, her character goes a bit off the rails towards the end of the film, but for the most part, she's A-OK in my book. I think this film's biggest accomplishments are found in the confrontational scenes, in particular when Eric and his aunt are arguing. These scenes, coupled with striking lighting and cinematography, create a brilliantly atmospheric setting and generate some of the film's most memorable moments. This film has a very strong visual identity, with smoky blue lighting used semi-regularly to give the film a more 50s noir-esque tint, which when utilised here really gives an added oomph to the horror elements. They even use quite a few tricks from the 40s and 50s in order to illustrate the murders on screen, with quite a few cutaway deaths masking impalements and other similar demises. Even with what few slip-ups this film has, one of the most notable to me being that they constantly reference Bela Lugosi's Dracula, but then when it comes to using any footage of the vampire, they show a clip from the Hammer adaptation in grayscale as a substitute. It's very impressive to see just how concise a vision was had on how this film should look and feel. In fact, the only criticism I have about the cinematography may be more down to the film's presentation on DVD than on the actual movie itself, as I found a couple of points on my copy of the film to be a little overly dark. Whether this was intentional or not, I can't honestly say, but if it was a genuine choice to make the night shots artificially darker, I can't say I'm particularly a fan. The direction, much like the cinematography, is reasonably tight. Cast members are for the most part a touch on the melodramatic side, but that's where the tongue-in-cheek elements of this film stem from. A few sites I looked at while doing research for this episode list this film as a comedy horror, which I think is terrifically misleading. If anything, it's merely replicating the melodrama of movies from the 40s and 50s, and I think it does it rather successfully, if not with a very sly nudge and a wink to the audience watching. The cast seem animated and very rarely feel overly stiff or unnatural, unless it's intended that way, and some of the famous movie scene recreations are very faithful to the original intentions, even if they've been somewhat twisted to the more disturbing nature of Eric's mental state. It's a more than passable stab at it. Where it kinda goes off the rails a bit for me lies predominantly in the pacing and identity of the plot. As this film is largely pooling from a mixing pot of films of yesteryear, one of the biggest problems I encountered was that around the 40-minute mark, the film sort of went a bit aimless for 15 to 20 minutes. There's a large set of scenes in the middle of this film where Eric seems to wander aimlessly around various landmarks, just being a bit weird. And while I can appreciate that the film is using this time to better get the audience on board with Eric's condition, it felt overly long and a bit aimless. There are sequences set in and around Eric's home and scenes at the end of the movie that equally just feel a bit like a film grabbing at air waiting for the next big set piece. I mean, it never strays into full-blown scene stuffing, but it would have maybe been in the interest of the film to have been a tighter 75-minuter rather than a slightly bloated 99-minuter. There are other elements of this film to me that really just don't work. For example, there's a subplot establishing the police presence in this film through a recently transferred criminal analyst, Dr. Moriarty. but he's in very few scenes and really isn't integrated into the main plot at all until the final 5 minutes of the film. It's all a bit Godfrey Ho to me. Literally, there's a scene where he first arrives, a scene where he gets to know a female cop partner a little better, a scene where he suspects that Eric might be up to something, though Eric isn't in the scene, it's just implied that a meeting happened off-screen. And then the next time we see the Doctor, it's the end of the movie, and we're just expected to go with the idea that they've been on this massive cat and mouse journey throughout the runtime. The lack of integration into the main plot really makes me feel like I'm watching two films that have been clumsily cut together. And it's a real shame because without those scenes, it would probably be a stronger movie. Moriarty, played by Tim Thomerson, is really just walking exposition. They needed an excuse for Eric and a doctor to meet and for some of Eric's family medical background to be mentioned, so they seem to have almost crammed this character into the film at the last minute just to cover up the plot holes. There's also a rather upsetting sequence in which Eric jerks off. You don't see his penis, but it goes on for an uncomfortably long time and doesn't really add anything to the plot other than reaffirming that Eric loves Marilyn Monroe. Just thought I'd flag that up because I can't in good faith let that one fly over the radar unmentioned. The soundtrack as well was just a bit bland. There are one or two stings that stuck out in my mind, but ultimately it's all a bit forgettable. Which I find interesting considering someone thought the soundtrack was good enough to release on its own, as there was an official soundtrack release in 2009 through Perseverance Records. Then again, I suppose it takes all sorts to make a world. Fade to Black was released in June 2000 by MIA. It's a value release with just scene selection and the film itself as menu options. The print's pretty clean, if not a little overly dark in places and a touch washed out. It's pretty much a certainty that this film is now out of print, and it hasn't been picked up for re-release for well over a decade at this point. Which is a real shame. It's got Arrow Video written all over it, and it'd look gorgeous in a 4K scan. There was also a novelisation of the film released sometime shortly after the film debuted. That's out of print across the board as well. But one of the benefits of mass-produced DVDs being out of print is that it's currently going for pence on Amazon. And for that cost, I'd definitely recommend picking it up. It may not be perfect, but for between 20 and 40 pence you could pick up much worse. I went into this film with very high hopes, and what I got was a bit of a mixed bag, but ultimately an enjoyable film. With a great cast, brilliant historical film knowledge, and a more than decent stab at lighting and cinematography, I'd definitely say that this film was worth watching at least once. And I'd argue that it's criminally underrated. It has its problems in the form of mild padding and some slightly weaker script writing in places, but if you can negotiate those rougher sequences, this film's a real hoot. I'd really love to watch this film in black and white next time, to see if it improves my opinion of it. Or maybe sandwiched in between a couple of public domain horror sci-fi films. Either way, it's definitely worth checking out.